30 years. 30 long years. I lived a lie inside my own home, with my own husband and the woman I thought was my best friend. What I'm going to share today is how I discovered that the Friday nights of my life were a macabre theater they staged at my expense. Good afternoon, my dears. My name is Helen Marshall. I'm 85 years old today, and I'm going to share with you a story I've kept deep in my heart for a very long time. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you who's watching to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a pleasure to know that my words reach so many different places. It was 1962. I had just turned 22. I was born and raised in a small town in Virginia, where everyone knew each other, where Sunday afternoons were spent in the town square, and where proper young ladies, as they used to say back then, had an almost predetermined fate: to marry, have children, and take care of the home. And I was no exception to that rule. It was what I wanted too, what all of us wanted. I met Robert at my cousin's birthday party. He wasn't from our town. He had come from the city to work at the only bank we had. Tall, elegant, always in a well-pressed suit, Robert stood out among the local boys. He had a way of looking, a way of speaking, that made it seem like the entire world stopped to listen to him. When he asked me to dance that night, I felt as if I'd won a prize. The courtship was quick, only 6 months. My father, a strict and traditional man, didn't like long courtships. He said it gave people reason to gossip. Robert asked for my hand on a Sunday after a family lunch. I remember the simple but beautiful ring, a small blue stone that he said matched my eyes. I cried with emotion. Of course I accepted. We married in a modest ceremony at the town church. My dress was sewn by my mother and 2 aunts, with fabric I had saved up to buy for months. It wasn't as luxurious as those nowadays, but to me it was the most beautiful in the world. Robert looked so elegant that day, so smiley. How could I imagine that behind that smile was a man capable of deceiving me for decades? The first years were like a dream. Robert was attentive, affectionate. He had gotten a promotion at the bank, and we were able to buy a small but comfortable house with a little backyard where I planted my flowers. We didn't have much luxury, but we didn't lack for anything. I took care of the house with all my love, making sure everything was impeccable when he came home from work. It was when we completed 3 years of marriage that Robert began to show an unusual interest in cooking. Suddenly, he wanted to learn how to cook. At the time, I thought it was strange. Men didn't enter the kitchen in the 60s. It wasn't common like it is today, but he insisted. He said he wanted to help me, that he had learned some recipes from his mother before she passed away. And so began a tradition in our house. Every Friday, Robert insisted on preparing dinner. In the beginning, I found it so romantic. Imagine, my friends were dying of envy when I told them that my husband cooked for me once a week. I felt special. I felt loved. Friday dinner always had something different. Robert went all out, made elaborate dishes, and always opened a bottle of wine. To celebrate the end of the week, he would say. And I, fool that I was, felt like the luckiest woman in the world. It was about 6 months after these dinners began that I started to feel something strange. After Friday meals, I would start to feel an inexplicable drowsiness, dizziness, a sensation of floating. At first, I thought it was the wine. I wasn't used to drinking. I was always very moderate. But even when I drank very little or even nothing at all, that feeling would come. "You work too hard, Helen," Robert would say with a tone of concern that I now know was false. "It's the tiredness of the whole week building up." And I believed him, because why wouldn't I believe the man I loved? Over time, the symptoms got worse. It wasn't just drowsiness anymore, they were actual blackouts. I would simply pass out on the couch after dinner, and when I woke up, it was already Saturday morning in our bed, dressed in my nightgown. Robert said he carried me to bed, that he took care of me. That's when the second act of this macabre theater began. On one of these Friday nights, still conscious but already feeling that familiar dizziness, I heard the doorbell. It was Marlene, a woman Robert had introduced as a colleague from work a few months earlier. She had recently moved to our town, also from the city, to work at the same bank as Robert. "Oh, Helen," Robert called me, concerned, said you weren't feeling well again, she said, as she entered with a tone of concern that years later I discovered was as false as chocolate coins. Robert explained that he had called her from the living room phone while I was in the bathroom, worried because I didn't seem well. Marlene was a nurse before working at the bank, he explained, and could help me in case I got sick again that night. Before completely blacking out, I remember seeing the two of them sitting in the living room talking in low voices. The last thing I heard was Marlene saying, "Don't worry, I'll take care of her." And so began a pattern that would last for years. Every Friday, I would have dinner, start feeling ill, and as if by miracle, Marlene would appear to help me. Over time, she became a constant presence in our home, not just on Fridays. She became my friend, someone I trusted, someone I confided in about my worries, including my mysterious fainting spells. "It must be some kind of nervous condition," she would suggest with false concern. "Many women suffer from this, Helen. My own mother had these episodes." I consulted doctors, of course. Robert always accompanied me, always so attentive, holding my hand while I described my symptoms. The doctors ran tests, but found nothing. One of them even suggested it was all in my head, that many women suffered from nervousness, and that I should try to calm down more. And so, week after week, month after month, year after year, I continued living in that strange routine. Every Friday I would have dinner, get sick, black out, and when I woke up on Saturday, Robert, and frequently Marlene, would be there taking care of me, concerned about me. During the week, my life proceeded normally. Robert was the perfect husband from Sunday to Thursday, attentive, affectionate, bringing me small gifts, complimenting me. How could I suspect anything? How could I imagine that the man who kissed my forehead every morning was poisoning my food every Friday? Time passed. The 60s gave way to the 70s, then to the 80s. Our hair started gaining white strands. Life followed its course. Robert was promoted to bank manager, then to regional director. Marlene remained close, increasingly present in our lives, increasingly my friend. She never married. She said she hadn't found the right man, that she preferred her independence. I admired her for that, for her strength, for her determination. Little did I know that the real reason was that she had already found a man, mine. The Friday blackouts continued, with some periods of interruption when Robert traveled for work. During these times, I felt an inexplicable relief, a feeling of lightness that at the time I couldn't understand. Today, I know it was simply my body thanking me for not being poisoned. We had an active social life. We were invited to events, parties. Robert was respected in town. Sometimes, at social gatherings, I noticed strange looks in my direction, whispers that stopped when I approached. At the time, I thought it was just envy of our seemingly perfect life. Only much later did I understand that some people knew or suspected what was happening in my house on Fridays. The decades passed, and I came to terms with that strange condition. Maybe it really was something with my nervous system, I thought. Maybe it was just tiredness, as Robert always said. I even thanked God for having such an understanding husband who wasn't bothered by my problems, and such a dedicated friend who was always around to help. That's how I lived for 30 years. 30 years of lost Fridays. 30 years of lies. 30 years with a wolf dressed as a sheep sleeping beside me. But as that old saying goes, God writes straight with crooked lines. And it was on a very crooked line that I found the truth that would change my life forever. Marlene, how to speak of that woman without my heart still tightening in my chest? Even after so many years, her name still brings a bitter taste to my mouth. She entered our lives casually, but soon became a constant presence, almost like a shadow in our house. It was in 1965 that I met her. Robert came home on a Wednesday and mentioned the new bank employee. "A very competent young woman," he said, "transferred from the city and doesn't know anyone in town. I thought about inviting her to dinner on Sunday." I, always hospitable, immediately agreed. After all, I knew well how difficult it was to adapt to a small town where everyone had known each other for years. Marlene showed up on Sunday, precisely at 6 in the afternoon, with a bottle of wine and a flower arrangement. Tall, elegant, with always impeccable brown hair and a smile that seemed sincere. How could I know that behind that smile hid so much falsehood? She had a way of speaking that captivated, told stories of the city, of places she had known, of famous people she had seen. For a small-town girl like me, it was fascinating. That night, Robert seemed different. He spoke more, laughed louder, was more animated than usual. At the time, I attributed it to the pleasure of having new company, someone to talk to about life in the big city, about the news that didn't reach our small town. Today, I understand it was the glow of the beginning of something forbidden, the excitement of what was to come. After that first dinner, Marlene began to appear more frequently. At first, always at Robert's invitation, then as my friend. She brought magazines from the city, told me about new fashions, taught me to use makeup in a more modern way. And I, naive as I was, felt flattered by her attention, by her interest in modernizing me, as she put it. "Helen, you're so pretty, but you dress like an old lady," she would comment while going through my wardrobe. "Let's update this look. Robert will love it." And so, little by little, she infiltrated my life. She chose my clothes, suggested new hairstyles, gave opinions on home decor, always with that smile, always with that false concern for my well-being. Like a spider weaving its web, she created a relationship of dependency, making me believe that I needed her advice, her approval. It was around 1967 that I first noticed something strange between the two. We were at a friend's house for one of those weekend parties that were common in our town. Robert was talking to Marlene in a corner, thinking no one was paying attention. I saw when their fingers touched for a moment longer than normal while taking a glass of champagne. I saw the look they exchanged. It was just a second, but enough to awaken a disquiet in my heart. I went home that night with a strange feeling, a discomfort I couldn't name. When I questioned Robert about his closeness to Marlene, he laughed, called me jealous, said I was imagining things. "She's your friend, Helen. I'm only being nice to her because I know how much you like her." And I believed, or rather, forced myself to believe, because the alternative was too painful to consider, because admitting the possibility of betrayal would mean crumbling the sandcastle I called marriage. The Friday dinners continued, and with them, my mysterious blackouts. In 1968, after a particularly strong episode, Robert finally agreed to take me to a specialist doctor in the city. Dr. Anthony was an elderly gentleman, a respected neurologist. He examined me carefully, asked questions, noted everything in his notebook. "Mrs. Helen, I find nothing physically wrong," he concluded. "But these blackouts always on Fridays are curious. Is there anything different that you do on that day?" Before I could answer, Robert intervened. "Doctor, my wife has a very regulated life. Nothing different happens on Fridays. I even prepare dinner myself so she can rest. It's our tradition." The doctor looked at Robert with an expression that at the time I didn't understand, but today I recognize as suspicion. He prescribed me vitamins, suggested more rest, and before we left, asked to speak to me alone. Robert didn't like it, but couldn't object without seeming strange. When we were alone, Dr. Anthony lowered his voice. "Mrs. Helen, are you sure there's nothing in common in these Friday dinners? No different ingredient? No special drink?" I assured him that no, it was just a normal dinner, sometimes with wine, sometimes not. The doctor looked at me for a long moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but ended up just sighing. "If the symptoms persist or worsen, come back to see me alone, if possible." I left the office intrigued by that conversation, but soon the daily worries took over, and I ended up forgetting. What I didn't realize was that after that consultation, Robert became more careful. The blackouts continued, but less intensely. I no longer blacked out completely, just entered a state of deep drowsiness, as if floating outside my body, unable to react but vaguely aware of what was happening around me. It was in one of these states of semi-consciousness, one night in 1969, that I heard something that should have awakened me to reality. Marlene, as usual, had appeared after dinner, supposedly concerned about my well-being. I was lying on the living room couch, apparently asleep. The two were talking in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear. "Don't you think you're overdoing the dose?" Marlene's voice sounded concerned. "Last time she was sick until Sunday." "Relax, I reduced it a bit." "She'll just sleep until tomorrow morning," Robert answered in an unconcerned tone. "And if someone gets suspicious? That doctor from the city seemed suspicious." "No one will suspect. Helen is known for having nervous problems. Everyone thinks it's all in her head." I remember feeling immensely confused. What were they talking about? What dose? Why would Robert say I had nervous problems? But before I could process that information, darkness enveloped me completely, and I lost consciousness. The next morning, I woke up with a terrible headache. I tried to remember the conversation I had heard, but everything seemed like a distant dream, fragmented. When I tried to mention it to Robert, he laughed and said, I must have dreamed it, that I was delirious because of the fever I had during the night. You were so agitated that I had to call Marlene to help me. She stayed here until late, putting cold compresses on your forehead. And once again, I believed, because it was easier to believe I had dreamed it than to accept the terrible alternative. The 70s arrived, bringing changes to the world and to our town. Robert was promoted again, now a regional director of the bank, which meant more status, more money, but also more travel. Curiously, when he traveled, I felt better. The nervous problems disappeared. I had more energy, more disposition. Marlene, on the other hand, seemed less enthusiastic about his travels. She always found a way to stop by the house when Robert was away, asking if I needed anything, if I was feeling well alone. Her concern seemed genuine, but there was something in her eyes that bothered me, a gleam of anxiety, of expectation. In 1972, Robert decided we needed a bigger house, more befitting his new position. We bought a residence in the best neighborhood of town, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, modern kitchen, and a large yard, where I could finally have the garden I had always dreamed of. The house even had a small attic, where we kept suitcases, Christmas decorations, and things we didn't use frequently. Marlene helped with the decoration, of course. She chose curtains, suggested colors for the walls, positioned furniture. Sometimes, when she and Robert discussed some detail of the decoration, I had the strange feeling of being a visitor in my own home, as if the decisions belonged to them, not to me. It was at this time that people began to comment, not openly, of course, but there were looks, whispers, conversations that stopped when I approached. Margaret, my neighbor in the new house, was the only one who dared to say something. "Helen, don't you find this friendship between your husband and Marlene strange? They seem so intimate." I defended them tooth and nail. Marlene was my friend, I told Margaret. Robert was just being kind to her, especially because he knew how much she meant to me. Margaret looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and disbelief, but didn't insist on the subject. As the years passed, I got used to my strange condition. The Friday blackouts were part of my life, as was Marlene's constant presence. At some point, I stopped questioning, stopped worrying. I accepted that there was something wrong with me, that I was nervous, fragile, as Robert always said. There were moments, however, when a flash of lucidity crossed my drugged consciousness, like when I woke up in the middle of the night and heard laughter coming from the living room, or when I found a scarf with a different perfume among Robert's clothes, or even when Marlene appeared wearing a brooch that had been my mother's, a brooch I kept in my jewelry box, and when I asked, she said Robert had given it to her as a birthday present. Small signs, small clues that my mind refused to put together, because the truth was too frightening, too painful, because admitting the truth would mean recognizing that I had wasted years of my life, that I had been deceived in the cruelest way possible by the man I loved and the woman I considered my friend. And so, between denial and confusion, between blackouts and semi-consciousness, between whispered truths that I refused to hear, I spent years of my life. Until one day, fate decided it was time to open my eyes in the most unexpected way possible. The years passed like pages of a book I didn't choose to read. The 70s gave way to the 80s, and I continued living in that strange fog of uncertainties. My hair, once a vibrant brown, was gaining silver strands. Wrinkles began to mark my face, small lines that told stories of smiles, but also of sleepless nights and silent worries. Robert turned 50 in 1982 with a big party at the town club. As regional director of the bank, he insisted on keeping up appearances. The cream of local society attended, all smiling, all praising the perfect couple we were. If only they knew the truth behind those rehearsed smiles. At that party, I observed Marlene from a distance. She had aged too, of course, but in a different way than I had. While I seemed to wither like a flower without water, she maintained a vitality that I secretly envied. Her hair, now with strategically placed gray streaks, was perfectly arranged. Her dress, elegant without being flashy, molded to her still slender body, and her eyes shone in a way that mine had forgotten how to do. During the party, I caught her in a corner, animatedly conversing with Robert. When I approached, both smiled that smile that now, looking back, I realized was rehearsed, calculated. "Helen, dear, we were just talking about you," Marlene said, with that honeyed voice she used when she wanted to disguise something. "I was telling Robert how elegant you look today. This blue dress enhances your eyes." The dress that she herself had chosen for me during one of those shopping afternoons when she insisted on renewing my wardrobe. The dress that, according to her, would make Robert proud to have me as his wife, as if I were an accessory, a trophy to be displayed. "Thank you, Marlene," I automatically responded with that social smile I had perfected over the years. "You look very elegant, too." Robert put his arm around my waist, a gesture of possession disguised as affection. "My two favorite women," he said, and laughed as if he had made an innocent joke. At the time, I interpreted that phrase as a compliment to our friendship. Today, I see the veiled cruelty in those words, the mockery disguised as affection. The early 80s brought changes to the world and also to our small town. Color television arrived in homes, bringing soap operas and programs that talked about previously forbidden topics: divorce, betrayal, female freedom. Subjects that were once whispered were now invading our living rooms every night. I remember watching a soap opera in which the protagonist discovered her husband's betrayal and, instead of silently forgiving as would be expected of a good wife of the 60s, she confronted him, demanded respect, and finally left him to rebuild her life. That impacted me deeply, although at the time I didn't know exactly why. Robert, who rarely took interest in soap operas, began to criticize that specific program. What nonsense, a woman abandoning her home like that over a trifle. In my day, wives knew their place. I remained silent, but something inside me stirred, as if a small bird, long asleep, was trying to flap its wings again. Fridays continued to be my particular nightmare. The blackouts persisted, although with different patterns over the years. There were periods when they were more intense, others when they were lighter. There were even some months in 1983 when they stopped completely when Robert was sent for extended training in the city. Those were 3 months of clarity, 3 months in which I rediscovered the pleasure of waking up without that mental fog that had accompanied me for so long. 3 months in which my body felt lighter, healthier. 3 months in which Marlene, curiously, was always too busy to visit me. When Robert returned, the Friday dinners and blackouts resumed, and with them, Marlene returned to frequenting our house assiduously. At this point, I no longer even questioned her constant presence. She had become such an intrinsic part of our routine as breakfast or the Sunday paper. In 1984, I consulted a new doctor. Not because of the blackouts, I had already given up finding an explanation for them, but because of frequent headaches that had begun to bother me. Dr. Paul was young, recently graduated, with new ideas and a different approach from the older doctors I had consulted before. "Mrs. Helen, these blackouts always on Fridays are very specific," he commented after I casually mentioned my condition. "And you say they began after your husband started preparing dinner on that day?" I confirmed without realizing where he was going. Have you ever considered the possibility that there might be a specific ingredient in these meals that could be causing an allergic reaction or something similar? I had never thought from that angle. Robert always prepared different dishes. There wasn't a clear pattern. And these headaches, when exactly did they begin? I tried to remember. They had started gradually but had become more intense in recent months. It could be a cumulative effect of something, the doctor murmured, more to himself than to me. Mrs. Helen, I'd like to run some specific tests, and if possible, the next time your husband prepares dinner, save a small sample of the food and drink. We can analyze it. I left the office intrigued by that conversation. For the first time in years, someone seemed to take my symptoms seriously, to search for a real cause, instead of attributing them to nervousness or female fragility. That Friday, I observed Robert in the kitchen with different eyes. I noticed how he insisted on serving my plate personally, how he insisted I drink the wine he had specifically chosen for the occasion. I tried to discreetly save a sample of the food, but before I could hide it, he entered the kitchen. "What are you doing, Helen?" he asked, with a casualness that didn't match the attention in his eyes. "Oh, I was saving a bit of the sauce to try making it another day," I lied, feeling my heart race. It was delicious. He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry about that. I'll make it again for you any day." And he threw away the small container where I had saved the sauce. That night, the blackout was more intense than usual. When I woke up on Saturday, Robert informed me that he had canceled my follow-up appointment with Dr. Paul. "That doctor is too young, too inexperienced," he said. "I've found a better specialist in the city. We'll consult him next month." We never went to that supposed specialist, and I never mentioned Dr. Paul or his suspicions again. The years continued to pass. In 1985, our town received a new public library with a more updated collection. I began to frequent it regularly, looking for books that could help me understand what was happening to me. I read about medicine, about psychology, about neurological conditions. Nothing seemed to explain my specific symptoms. Until one day, on a shelf of newly arrived books, I found a volume on toxicology. I flipped through it out of curiosity and stopped at a chapter about substances that affect the central nervous system. The description of certain sedatives and their effects, drowsiness, mental confusion, loss of consciousness, sounded strangely familiar. I took the book home, hidden in my purse, afraid Robert would see what I was reading. During the afternoons when he was at work, I studied those pages with a veracity I hadn't felt in years. There was a possibility forming in my mind, too terrible to be named, but that would explain so many things. On a Friday in 1986, I pretended to drink the wine Robert served, but discreetly poured it into a plant pot when he went to the kitchen to get dessert. I still ate dinner, however, and even without the wine, the familiar torpor began to take hold of me. But this time, determined to remain conscious, I fought against that sensation with all my strength. I closed my eyes, pretended to fall asleep on the couch as usual, but kept my mind alert. As expected, Marlene appeared. I heard the doorbell, heard the whispers at the entrance, heard footsteps approaching the living room where I was supposedly asleep. "Is she out?" Marlene's voice asked. "Completely. Didn't even need the wine today," Robert answered, and there was a note of pride in his voice that froze my blood. I felt fingers touch my pulse, checking my heartbeat. It was Marlene with her ex-nurse experience. "Yes, she's quite unconscious. We have the whole night." What happened next in my own living room, while I pretended to be unconscious, confirmed my worst suspicions: the whispers, the muffled laughter, the sound of kisses. Everything I had refused to see for so many years was happening a few feet away from me. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing controlled, while my heart silently broke into pieces. I heard when they headed to the guest room, never to our marital bedroom, this small detail that I suppose was meant to be a form of respect on their part. I heard the door close, and finally, when I was sure they couldn't see me, I let the tears flow freely down my face. That night, lying on the couch, with my eyes open, fixed on the ceiling, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Robert immediately. I wouldn't make a scene. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken, destroyed. First, I needed concrete proof. I needed to fully understand what was happening, and most importantly, I needed a plan. The next day, I acted normally, as if nothing had changed. I served breakfast to Robert with the same smile as always. We talked about trivialities, about the weather, about plans for Sunday. Inside, however, I was boiling with rage, with pain, with a determination I hadn't felt in decades. In the following weeks, I began to pay more attention, to observe patterns, to collect small clues. I noticed how Robert carefully guarded certain kitchen cabinets, how he became tense when I approached while he was preparing Friday dinner. I noticed how Marlene always wore a specific perfume on Fridays, different from what she wore on other days. I noticed exchanged looks, silent codes, a whole secret language they had developed over the years, right under my nose. I began to make small changes in my routine. I started attending a painting class on Wednesdays to have an excuse to leave the house and do research at the library without raising suspicions. I began to keep some of the household money Robert gave me, hiding it in a false lining I created in an old purse. I bought a small notebook where I noted everything I discovered, all the pieces of that macabre puzzle. During one of these research afternoons, I found an article about a judicial case in which a man had been convicted of regularly drugging his wife to abuse her with friends. The similarity to my situation made me physically sick. I had to run to the library bathroom to vomit. When I recovered, I faced the bathroom mirror. The face that stared back at me was pale, eyes wide with horror, but there was also something new there, a fierce determination, an incandescent anger that had replaced the apathy of recent years. Enough, I whispered to my reflection. Enough of being a victim. Enough of living in darkness. I was no longer a naive 22-year-old girl. I was a woman of almost 50 who had lost decades of her life to an elaborate lie. But there was still time. There was still a chance to recover my dignity, my autonomy, my life. And it was with this certainty that I began to plan my liberation. What I didn't know was that fate was about to lend me a hand, revealing the truth in a way I could never have imagined. I've always believed that God writes straight with crooked lines. Sometimes, the revelation we seek for years comes in the most unexpected way possible. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in October 1987 that my life changed forever. Autumn had arrived with its typical combination of warm afternoons and cold nights. Robert was traveling to a banking conference in Chicago, and I was taking advantage of those rare days of freedom to reorganize the house. Not that he forbade me from tidying our things, but there were always certain spaces he preferred I didn't touch: his office, specific drawers, and, of course, the attic. "It's just bank papers and dusty old things," he always said when I mentioned cleaning the attic. "It's not worth tiring yourself over it." But on that Tuesday, with the house empty and 3 whole days ahead of me, I decided it was time to challenge that veiled prohibition. The attic needed a good cleaning, and what harm could there be in organizing some old boxes? The stairs leading to the attic creaked under my feet as if protesting against my audacity. I opened the door and was greeted by that characteristic smell of places closed for a long time. Dust, old paper, wood. The dim light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling revealed piles of boxes, old suitcases, Christmas decorations we had used for decades. I began cleaning methodically, opening each box, checking its contents, deciding what to keep and what to discard. It was in the 3rd hour of this work that I found something unusual. At the bottom of a box, apparently full of old bank documents, there was a small metal box of the type used to store medications. Upon opening it, I found several small bottles, some empty, others still with pills or powders. All were meticulously labeled with dates, all Fridays from recent years. My heart raced when I understood what I was seeing. They were the physical evidence of what I already suspected. Robert had been systematically drugging me, week after week, year after year. With trembling hands, I continued exploring the box. There was also a notebook, A kind of diary where Robert noted the doses, the effects, clinical observations. Almost increased dose this week, satisfactory effect, unconscious until 9 the next morning. Tried Dr. V's new pill. Less drowsiness the next day, but equal efficacy. I felt my stomach turn. There was something so cold, so calculating in those notes, as if I were a guinea pig, a scientific experiment, and not his wife of almost 3 decades. But the worst was yet to come. At the bottom of the metal box, I found a brown envelope. Inside it, photographs, dozens of them organized chronologically, showing, I can't even describe it without my voice failing. They were images of Robert and Marlene in our house, on our couch, sometimes in the guest bedroom. In many of them, I appeared in the background, visibly unconscious on the couch or bed, a hunting trophy, a decorative object in the scene of their illicit encounters. The oldest photos were from 1966, just a year after I met Marlene. More than 20 years of betrayal carefully documented, as if it were a sick collection of pinned butterflies. I sat on the dusty attic floor with that evidence spread around me and allowed the tears to come. They weren't tears of sadness, although there was a deep pain there. They were tears of anger, of indignation, of a fury so intense it felt like it would consume me from within. When I finally managed to compose myself, I put the evidence in a bag and hid it in the closet, under piles of winter clothes I rarely used. Then, with meticulous care, I reorganized the attic exactly as it was before, ensuring that Robert wouldn't know I had been there. That night, lying alone in our double bed, I elaborated a plan. It wouldn't be an emotional confrontation. It wouldn't be a public scandal. It would be a silent liberation, methodical, as calculated as the plan they had executed against me for so many years. In the days that followed, while Robert was still traveling, I put my plan into action. First, I went to the bank, not the bank where Robert worked, but a branch in another town. I opened an account in my name, using documents I had kept for years in a box of mementos. I deposited the money I had secretly saved over the years. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a start. Next, I visited a lawyer, Mr. Mitchell, an elderly gentleman who had recently retired and who, crucially, didn't belong to Robert's social circle. I took with me some of the evidence, not all, just enough to establish the seriousness of the situation. Mrs. Helen, he said after examining the documents with an expression that mixed shock and compassion, this is extremely serious. Your husband could face criminal charges for this. I explained that I didn't want a criminal process. I didn't want to expose that humiliating situation publicly. I just wanted my freedom, my dignity back, and a fair share of the assets we had built together over almost 30 years of marriage. Divorce is no longer the scandal it was a few years ago, Mr. Mitchell explained. With this evidence, you're in a very strong position to negotiate favorable terms. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that your husband may not react well. I left the lawyer's office with a concrete plan and a deadline. December 31st, 1987. I decided I wouldn't spend another year living that lie. The new year would bring a new Helen. When Robert returned from his trip, I continued acting normally. I prepared his meals, kept the house in order, smiled at the appropriate moments, but something had fundamentally changed inside me. I was no longer the same submissive, confused, eternally sick woman. I was an actress playing a role, just waiting for the right moment to leave the stage. Fridays continued with their macabre ritual, but now I was conscious, alert. I discovered ways to discreetly discard the contaminated food and drink. A bit in the plant pot, a bit in the napkin, another portion simply by not eating, claiming I wasn't hungry. I pretended the expected symptoms, the drowsiness, the confusion, and finally, the blackout on the couch. And every Friday, I watched through half-closed eyes as Marlene arrived, the whispers, the muffled laughter, the betrayal happening a few feet away from me. Each occurrence was carefully documented in my secret notebook. Each detail noted to strengthen my case. November arrived with its characteristic rains, and with it an opportunity I couldn't ignore. The bank where Robert worked offered an early retirement package for employees with more than 30 years of service. At 56, he qualified perfectly. "I think I'll accept," he commented during dinner. "The amount is very good, and I could finally have time to travel, to enjoy life." Travel with Marlene was what he didn't say. Enjoy the life he had built upon my ruins. "That would be wonderful," I replied, with an enthusiasm that pleased him. "You deserve to rest after so many years of hard work." What Robert didn't know was that his retirement was the final piece of my puzzle. With the retirement package payment, our financial situation would be clear and documented, facilitating the division of assets in the divorce. December arrived, bringing with it the end-of-year festivities and a growing tension within me. Each day brought me closer to the moment of truth. I bought presents, decorated the house for Christmas, baked cookies and cakes like the perfect wife everyone believed I was. In the week between Christmas and New Year, Robert received his retirement payment. That same afternoon, he transferred a significant amount to an account that I later discovered was Marlene's. I meticulously documented everything and handed the information to Mr. Mitchell. "We're ready," he confirmed. "We can proceed as soon as you wish." The night of December 31st, 1987, will forever be etched in my memory. Robert and I went to a party at a friend's house, as we did every year. Marlene was also there, of course. I observed the two of them during the night, the exchanged glances, the discreet touches when they thought no one was watching. But I always saw now. At midnight, when everyone embraced and celebrated the arrival of 1988, Robert hugged me and wished me a wonderful year, full of health. The irony didn't escape me. I returned the hug, whispering in his ear, "It will be a year of great changes." He smiled without understanding the true meaning of those words. We returned home in the early hours of 1988. Robert fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the party and the champagne. I, however, remained awake, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom, knowing it would be one of the last nights in that house, in that life. On January 2nd, while Robert was still sleeping, recovering from the New Year's celebration, I took the small suitcase I had secretly prepared days before. In it were some clothes, important documents, and the evidence I had collected. I left on the kitchen table an envelope containing a simple letter. "Robert, I know everything. I won't be coming back. My lawyer will be in touch." I walked out the front door without looking back. Mr. Mitchell had arranged a small apartment for me in a neighboring town where I could stay while the divorce proceedings were ongoing. As I got into the waiting taxi, I felt a mixture of terror and exultation. At 47, I was starting my life over from scratch. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Robert tried to contact me dozens of times, alternating between desperate pleas and veiled threats. Marlene also tried to find me, claiming concern about my mental state. I ignored both, communicating only through my lawyer. When Robert finally understood the extent of the evidence I possessed, his attitude changed. Suddenly, he was willing to negotiate, to offer a generous settlement. He didn't want a scandal, didn't want his actions to become public. His reputation, his social position, everything would be threatened. At the end of February, we signed the divorce papers. I received half of all assets, including a significant portion of his retirement. The house was sold, and with my share, I bought a small apartment in the city, far from all the memories, from all the lies. I learned from mutual acquaintances that Robert and Marlene made their relationship official a few months later. They moved to another town where no one knew their history, where they could reinvent their past without the weight of the truth. As for me, I faced the most difficult challenge of all, rediscovering who Helen was after decades living in the shadow of a lie. Who was I, beyond Robert's wife? What did I like? What did I dream of? What did I wish for my future? The answers didn't come easily. There were days of deep depression, nights of insomnia, moments when I questioned my decision. But slowly, like a flower that finally finds light after years in darkness, I began to bloom. In March 1988, I enrolled in a literature course at the local university. I had always loved reading, but had never thought of studying formally. At 47, I was easily the oldest student in the class, but that didn't intimidate me. For the first time in my life, I was doing something exclusively for myself, by my own choice. It was on the university campus, among books and passionate discussions about Hemingway and Virginia Woolf, that I began to find myself again. No longer the docile and sick wife, no longer the victim of a cruel conspiracy, but simply Helen, a woman with her own mind, with her own voice, with a whole life ahead of her. You know what I discovered about freedom? It has a sweet taste, but also a slightly bitter one. Sweet from the relief of finally breathing without the weight of the lie. Bitter from the lost decades, from the postponed dreams, from the versions of myself I never had the chance to meet. The year 1988 was a rebirth. After enrolling in the literature course, something within me awakened like a long dormant spring. The words, the books, the stories, all of it nourished me in a way I had never experienced. I spent entire nights poring over books, not out of obligation, but from an insatiable hunger for knowledge, for beauty, for truth. My classmates, young people in their early 20s, initially looked at me with curiosity, perhaps even with a little condescension. What was that gray-haired lady doing there among them? But soon age became irrelevant in the face of the shared enthusiasm for the works we were studying. I vividly remember a class on Virginia Woolf discussing Mrs. Dalloway. Professor Cecilia, an energetic middle-aged woman, asked for our interpretation of the protagonist Clarissa Dalloway. "She seems to me a woman who never appropriated her own story," I commented, feeling each word resonate within me. Someone who lives on the margins of her own life, who doesn't even know she can want more, dream more. Dr. Cecilia looked at me with renewed interest. "Fascinating perspective, Helen. Would you say there's a parallel between Dalloway's journey and the journey of so many women of our generation?" That question opened a floodgate within me. I spoke about social expectations, about marriages that were disguised prisons, about female invisibility. I didn't mention my personal story, of course, but every word was soaked in my experience. When the class ended, Dr. Cecilia invited me for coffee. It was the beginning of a friendship that endures to this day, one of the first genuine connections I formed in my new life. At the end of that first semester, I received an unexpected invitation. The literature department was looking for assistants for a reading promotion project in public schools. They needed people to visit schools, tell stories, help children discover the pleasure of reading. "I thought of you immediately," said Dr. Cecilia. "You have a way of talking about literature that awakens interest, that creates connections." In August 1988, I visited my first school. A room full of 10-year-olds stared at me with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. I held the book I had chosen, a story by Mark Twain, and began to read. To my surprise, the words flowed naturally. I modulated my voice for each character. I made dramatic pauses at the right moments. My gestures illustrated the narrative without me even realizing it. When I finished, I saw in the eyes of those children something I immediately recognized: the enchantment that only a good story can provoke. "Will you come back next week?" asked a little boy with big, curious eyes. I returned the next week and the one after that, and in all the weeks that followed. The project, which was supposed to last only one semester, extended indefinitely. Soon I was visiting several schools, telling stories, conducting reading workshops, helping children write their own narratives. In 1989, Dr. Cecilia suggested I formalize my pedagogical training. "You have a gift for teaching, Helen. With a degree, you could do this professionally." At 49, I enrolled in an education course. I studied in the morning, visited schools in the afternoon, read compulsively at night. My small apartment gradually transformed into a private library with books stacked on every available surface. It was during this period that I began to write. At first, they were just personal reflections, a therapeutic diary to process everything I had lived through. Later, short stories, fictional stories that nevertheless carried fragments of my own experience. "You should publish this," Dr. Cecilia commented after reading one of my stories. "There's a raw truth in your writing that touches deeply." I laughed at the suggestion. Me, a published writer? It seemed absurd, but the seed had been planted. I graduated in education in 1992 at 52. At the graduation ceremony, I looked around and saw young faces, lives just beginning. I felt a pang of sadness for the lost time, but also an immense pride for the woman I had become despite everything. Shortly after graduation, I received an invitation to teach at a public school in the suburbs. The salary was modest, the conditions challenging, but I accepted without hesitation. On my first morning as an official teacher, I entered the classroom feeling a mixture of terror and exultation. My students, children of 8 and 9, looked at me with that characteristic curiosity, evaluating that gray-haired teacher with a nervous smile. A boy raised his hand. "Aren't you too old to be a teacher, ma'am?" The entire class froze, waiting for my reaction. I looked at that sincere little face and smiled. "You know, Johnny, sometimes it takes us a little longer to discover what we really want to do in life. It took me 50 years to discover I wanted to be a teacher, but now that I've discovered it, I intend to be the best teacher you've ever had." That spontaneous response defined my approach as an educator. I never hid my story, not the sordid details, of course, but the general arc of a woman who found her vocation later in life. I used my own journey to inspire my students never to give up on learning, on growing, on reinventing themselves. The 90s passed in a whirlwind of activities. Besides teaching, I continued with the Reading Promotion Project, now as a coordinator. We organized literary fairs, poetry contests, author visits to schools. My life, once so restricted to the four walls of a house that was never truly mine, expanded in all directions. It was in 1995, during one of these literary fairs, that I met August. He was a writer, author of children's books, invited to speak about his work to our students. Tall, with white hair and vivid blue eyes, he had a contagious energy when talking about the power of stories. After the event, we talked at length about literature, education, the pleasure of reading. There was an ease in our interaction, a mutual understanding that caught me by surprise. When he suggested continuing our conversation at a nearby cafe, I accepted without hesitation. A cup of coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into an invitation to see a play the following weekend. At 55, I found myself experiencing something I had never genuinely experienced before. A romance based on mutual respect, on shared interests, on an authentic connection. August was a widower, having lost his wife to cancer years before. He had 2 adult children and 3 grandchildren, all living in other cities. Like me, he had found in literature a way to make sense of life, to process losses, to celebrate small joys. Our relationship blossomed slowly, unhurriedly. We weren't impulsive youth, but mature adults who had learned, each in their own way, the value of honesty, of clear communication, of respect for individual spaces. In 1997, we moved into a small but cozy house with a backyard where I planted the flowers I had always dreamed of having. We didn't officially marry. Both of us had too many scars from past experiences to feel comfortable with the institution of marriage. But we built a solid partnership, a chosen family, a home in the true sense of the word. It was August who encouraged me to seriously resume my writing. In 1998, at 58, I published my first book, a collection of children's stories inspired by the tales I told my students. To my surprise, the book was well received, not only by children, but also by educators who found in the narratives valuable tools for classroom discussions. In 2000, I formally retired from teaching, but continued to be involved with educational projects, now as a volunteer. I also intensified my literary production. My second book, published in 2001, addressed more complex themes: aging, the search for identity, the small daily new beginnings. Although still written for young readers, it contained layers that also resonated with adults. In 2005, I received an invitation to share my experience at an education congress. I spoke about the importance of literature as a tool for transformation, as a window to possible worlds, as a mirror where we recognize ourselves. At the end of the lecture, a young teacher approached. "Your story has deeply inspired me," she said. "I always thought that at 35 it was already too late to change careers, but listening to you, I realize it's never too late to start over." That comment moved me deeply. My personal journey, with all its pains and joys, was inspiring others to seek their own paths. Somehow, even the lost years, the sufferings endured, gained new meaning in light of this possibility. Today, at 85, I look back and see a life divided into two distinct parts. The almost 30 years of marriage to Robert, living an elaborate lie, and the subsequent 38 years building an authentic, meaningful existence, entirely my own. August departed 5 years ago, peacefully in his sleep. I miss him every day, but I carry with me gratitude for the 25 years we shared, for the moments of simple joy, for the deep conversations, for the unconditional support we offered each other. I continue writing, now with 12 published books. I continue visiting schools, although less frequently now that my joints protest against long walks. I still live in the same house, tending the same garden, surrounded by books, by memories, by a peace I fought hard to achieve. Sometimes, in rare moments of weakness, I wonder how my life would have been if I had discovered the truth earlier, if I had had the courage to leave sooner. Would I have met August? Would I have become a teacher, a writer? Would I have impacted the lives I've impacted? But I soon pushed those thoughts away. I cannot change the past. I cannot recover the lost years. I can only appreciate the present, celebrate the woman I've become, despite everything, or perhaps partly because of everything. Robert and Marlene? I heard he passed away in 2010, after years battling Alzheimer's. A cruel irony for someone who spent decades manipulating another person's mind. Marlene is still alive, from what I know, in some southern town, alone and bitter, according to mutual acquaintances. I don't harbor hatred for them. Hatred is too heavy a burden to carry in old age. What I feel is a kind of distant compassion for two people who built their happiness on another's suffering, who never knew the genuine joy of a true connection, of a life lived with authenticity. My story is not one of vengeance, nor of bitterness. It's of rebirth, of late self-discovery, of second chances seized with both hands. It's the story of a woman who woke up from a long-induced sleep and decided finally to fully live each day she had left. If there's a lesson I'd like to leave, especially for the women watching me, it's this. It's never too late to reclaim your own story, to rewrite the script of your life, to become the protagonist instead of a supporting character. Whether at 20, at 50, or at 80, you always have the right and the power to say, "This is my life, and from now on, I decide how it will be lived." Thank you for accompanying me this far on this journey. If my story touched your heart, please leave your like, subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel for more stories like this, and share with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over. And don't forget to tell me in the comments what you thought and where you're watching from. Each message from you brightens my days.